2 weeks ago, I provided historical context for the wild temperature swings that were so common this past meteorological spring. One consequence of the temperature whiplash was serious damage to many fruit crops in the state. Here I'd like to put that situation in historical context using research from state climatologist Kyle Imhoff. Now, a measure called growing degree days, or GDDs, is used to track the growth cycle for many crops. GDDs are calculated for each day by taking the difference between the average temperature for the day, which is just the high plus the low divided by 2, and some base value. 50 degrees is typically used for most fruits. And by the way, if this difference is negative, the GDD value is simply set to 0. The sum of the daily GDDs from the start of the year measures where a crop is in its growth cycle. And for many fruit varieties grown in the state, the typical cycle starts when that sum gets to be between 100 and 300. Now, here's the accumulated GDDs around the state on April 20th, just before the big freeze, generally between 200 and 350. To put these in context, here's where that stood historically. At nearly every observing site, it was a top 3 highest accumulated GDD value on record for that date. And finally, here's when those values would be reached in an average year. Everywhere, a good 3 to 4 weeks later than what happened this year. So on April 20th, from the standpoint of a typical growing season, fruit plants were way ahead of schedule. Then came the cold. Here's the morning low temperature on April 21st, though Erie's 29 was on April 20th. And here's where those values stood historically for that date, in the top 5 coldest at 6 of the 8 stations. And it was relatively late in the season to have such chill. Here's the average last date in the spring for temperatures this low. So typically, most places experience these values for the final time in spring 2 to 3 weeks earlier, in late March or the first week of April. So summarizing, we had anomalously high growing degree days built up by April 20th, initiating fruit growth several weeks ahead of schedule, followed by low temperatures in the mid to upper 20s for most spots a couple weeks later than is typical. For all 8 locations we looked at, this combination had never occurred previously in the period of record, and that provided conditions conducive to freeze injury for many fruit crops. What happened this year is consistent with long-term trends in which spring temperatures are increasing on average, leading to faster early season accumulation of growing degree days. But the date of the last spring freeze has shifted only a few days for most places. So while crops may increasingly reach sensitive growth stages earlier, the occurrence of damaging chill has not diminished at a comparable rate, helping to at least partly explain the heightened vulnerability observed this year. Stay tuned. We'll be back in a moment with more.